Hi, it's Jo from Minerva. Today we're going to look at some common sewing errors. So if you're new to sewing and things are going a little bit wrong, then maybe some of the tips from today might help you in your sewing journey. The first place to start is when you choose your pattern and your fabric right from the start. So if you're looking at a pattern and you really like the style of it, then you need to check the back of the pattern instructions to see what fabric you can use. All fabrics behave differently, and sometimes you'll want a fabric that creates structure, and sometimes you'll want a fabric that creates a drape, and sometimes you might need a fabric that has a stretch. Let's look at a couple of patterns. It depends on whether you've chosen your fabric first and you're trying to match a pattern, or if you've picked a pattern then you're trying to match your fabric. But either way, you need the right fabric for the right pattern for your project to be successful. If you are picking something structured like the Jane Pinafore from Bobbins and Buttons, that suggests a medium weight fabric, so that's a denim or a cord or a heavy linen. So you'll be needing a fabric that will hold its shape, because a pinafore has tabs, so you don't want those to be all floppy. You want those to have the structure so that you can put your top underneath. And this is a baby cord, so this is a medium weight fabric but quite a lightweight cord. And that would make a pinafore, but of course you can make a chunkier look pinafore if you use a cord with a bigger wale. If you're picking a pattern like McCall's 7714, then that dress has got much more structure in it. So it's got the pleat, box pleats in the skirt, so you'll get a sort of 1950s style, and that will give the skirt much more structure. So you'll need to be picking a woven fabric that holds the shape when you make different features in your pattern. So you need to be picking a fabric that's got a firmness. So this is a cotton, and it's holding its shape. It's holding these drapes, and it will really press well to make a pleat. Not always, but sometimes patterns with a drape have less fitting. So they'll need a fabric that will float and fill in gaps and areas. So if you look at the Elodie wrap dress, you'll see that the sleeves are really billowing, but if you had a firm fabric like the ones that I've just shown you, you would have a triangle sticking out of the end of your shoulder, and you wouldn't get that draping feeling, and you wouldn't get an effective waist where you tie the band round. A fabric here needs to be drapey so that you can gather and cinch in the waist and you make the pleats with the belt. Fabrics with a viscose in will drape really well. If you see a linen fabric and it has a viscose content as well, you'll have a linen effect fabric, so you have that nice sort of slubby texture, but then you'll have the viscose in the fibres will help the fabric to drape. So that is a great choice. Sometimes it's called challis, sometimes it's called rayon, but have a look for anything with a viscose content will really change the drape of the fabric. The other things to pair with drapey fabric are ruffles and peplums and anything that's got a gather in it, because the fabric gathers up really nicely and you will get a drape rather than it sticking out like a sort of little girl's dress. This is the chalk and notch Farrah dress. You'll see that the ruffles on the shoulders go right down and down under the arm sike, and a viscose challis or any fabric with a viscose content will give you that drape. Crepe will also do the same, that's 100% polyester, and so that's a little bit slippier to work with. Although viscose is drapey, it's not slippy. It's got a very matte cotton finish, and crepe has a more shiny synthetic finish. If you want to work with a stretch fabric, then you need to make sure you've got a stretch pattern that you're working with. So I've got the Grainline Studio Linden. So this will work with both a t-shirt fabric and a sweatshirt fabric. So this is a sweatshirt fabric that's got an element of stretching, but it's not really stretchy. So it's stretchy in one direction, but not the other. It's got a sort of terry back on it, and that would be suitable for a sweatshirt because you would get the stretch across the width, but it wouldn't stretch down and make an elongated out of shape sweatshirt. Sometimes a pattern will tell you the stretch recovery, so you can have a look at how stretchy your fabric needs to be. So don't just get caught into the pattern or the colour of the fabric when you choose it online. You need to check the description and match it to your pattern requirements. This is the Rio Ringer t-shirt by True Bias, and this one has a t-shirt fabric, so it's looking for a jersey knit. So it's looking for something with a much stretchier stretch recovery in more than one direction, so that you can have the tight ringer sleeves. So don't forget to make sure that before you start your project, you've got the right fabric for your pattern for the best success. The best place to find out as well is to check out a Minerva maker. So if you want to go a little bit off the wall, then you can check out that pattern and see what sort of fabrics other people have made it in. Once you've got your pattern and your fabric, you need to find out what size to cut, and that can also be a little bit tricky because we're sort of brainwashed into thinking that we're all a number, and that's from our ready-to-wear size, and we've maybe grown up and gone to the shops and bought clothes in different sizes, but really that is just a number. The most important thing if you are making your own garments is to take your own measurements and just don't even think of that number. Because we have on our website a mix of indie patterns and major pattern company patterns, they're all using different sizes. So some are from Europe, some are from America, some are from other countries where they're having different sizing standards. When you take your measurement, always take your upper bust measurement, because that will give you the best measurement for your shoulder shape and your body cage shape here and across your back. If you simply take a bust measurement, you will have, yes, it will fit your bust, but it might be hanging off your shoulders, it might be too tight across your shoulders. So you need to learn how to do a bust adjustment rather than just pick your bust size. Quite a few patterns have finished garment measurements, and that's really useful. On the chalk and notch Farrah dress, I measured myself using my upper bust, and I was in quite a high size category. And just before I cut, I thought, oh, I'm just going to check the finished garment measurements. And actually, when I did, I found out the circumference of the bust, and it had a lot of ease in it. So I just sized down. So make sure that you check your own measurements, and then check any finished garment measurements if the pattern provides them. The best thing to do is not think of yourself as a number, but just think, I need to take my measurements because I'm making an item for myself. So you've got your pattern, you've got your fabric, you've measured yourself, and now it's time to cut out. You need to make sure that you understand a little bit about grain line so that you cut your fabric effectively, efficiently, and using the right behaviour of the fabric. So you need to put your fabric selvage to selvage. And when you put your fabric selvage to selvage, then the grain line, the straight grain, will run down parallel to the selvage. The cross grain sometimes is a little bit stretchy, not always, but there's a bit more give in the cross grain. So if you start to manipulate your pattern and move them around, you might miss the advantage of that cross grain. Some patterns have a pattern layout, so you can copy that, but more often than not, you might have a fabric that's a slightly different width, so you can jiggle around a little bit, but you can't turn pieces or ignore the grain lines on the pattern pieces, because they will be that way so that the fabric behaves in a particular way when it's worn. A big sewing error is to lay out your fabric and put your first pattern piece on and cut that out, then move the fabric along, then put the next piece and cut out. And it can be really dangerous, because the closer you get to the end of your piece of fabric, the more you're wondering whether you're going to fit it on. So always pin all of your pieces on before you even cut your fabric. I know it's difficult because if you are working on the floor or you've got a very small countertop space, but just roll it up, move it along, roll it up, move it along, and make sure you've got all your pieces on before you cut out. That will avoid a huge cutting error. If you think you're going to run out of fabric, then it's a good idea to pin out your main pieces first. So if you were pinning a shell top and you've only got a little bit of fabric left, pin the back on, the front on, the sleeves on. Don't worry about the facings. Get your main pieces, because you can always cut your facings out of a different fabric of the same weight. Before you speed up and whip all your pins out and go over to where you sew, you need to make sure that all of your notches are marked. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can do it with a chalk pencil, or you can do it with an air erasable pen. You can put a little snip in the seam allowance. You can also make a little V shape on the fabric when you cut out, but you need the notches, and there's no point ignoring them, because as soon as you start your instructions, it will mention them and it will tell you to match one thing to another thing, and if you don't know where they are, then you can't accurately sew. It seems like a real faff to do it in the first place, but it will save you time in the long run, and it will stop you making sewing errors. Hopefully you've eliminated all of the errors that you could make so far, and now it's time to sew. So let's have a look at the sewing machine and look at a few common errors that happen when you start to sew. Always check the seam allowance on a pattern. They're different for different patterns. I've been using a few Stylock patterns just lately, and they've got a 1 centimetre seam allowance, but if I use one of the major pattern companies, they're a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So that little half a centimetre will make a huge difference to the fit. So I need to make sure that I'm using the seam allowances that the pattern has suggested, because that will make the finished size of my garment. So you make sure that you're using either the measurements on your foot plate. I've got a little seam guide, which is a magnet, and it sticks to the foot plate, and I can run my fabric along the edge. So seam allowance issues will really compound your problems, because if you use a different seam allowance here to the facing that you're putting underneath, then the facing won't fit the neck hole. So your seam allowances will help you to construct your garment accurately, and all the pieces will fit together. Another thing that will help you get your garment to fit together properly so that you can avoid errors is to press the seams as you go along. So if you make this shoulder seam, press it open. When you make the facing, press it open. Then you've made the two pieces of fabric as flat as they can be so that they can join together. If you attempt to press everything at the end, or I'll press it at the end when I'm finished, then some of these seams will have a little kink in them. There'll be little bubbles, there'll be little puckers where the two seams don't quite fit together properly. If you don't have a sewing space where you can have a ironing board out, then try and find a way to set yourself up with something small. I've got a little small ironing board which I have out on the table. You can get a mini iron, you can get an ironing mat, you can use an iron on a different surface, but you need to have an iron when you start to sew and you get your machine out. The iron needs to come out at the same time. Other common sewing errors happen with your sewing machine. So I could do lots and lots of things that go wrong with a sewing machine, but I just want to show you today my first tip, which is to not start too close to the end. If you start at the very end of the fabric, it chews it down into the feed dog, into the little zigzags that run along. They'll sort of chew it up and it'll go down into the bottom of the plate. You need to just start a little bit away from the end of your seam, go forwards, and then you can go back and fill in that last little bit at the end. It's really important that your seam allowance starts well from that end, because at the end of the fabric tends to be where you're joining the next piece. So let me show you a little bit closer at what happens when the fabric is too close to the end. When you put your fabric under the machine, make sure that through the hole that the needle goes down, you can clearly see some fabric. If you just put the very tip of the foot on, then your first stitch will be too close to the edge. You can see, because I came right to the end, then I have this at the beginning, which is where it takes some of the fabric and squidges it up. So you don't need to go right off the end, you just need to go 1 or 2 stitches from the end and then go forwards and back. At the beginning I made sure I started on the end, so this end is really nice and flat, this end is very, very puckered. A sewing machine is doing a complicated threading process for you, so if you don't get it off to the right start, you'll get all knotted up. So if you just leave your threads hanging from the needle and sort of just hanging anywhere, when you start, it will get knotted up. My threads have got caught around the back of here. And it's all got knotted up at the start. And that's because I didn't give it a good start. So I need to make sure that the thread is going through the foot and out to the back. And all of my threads are out of the back and out of the way. So let's avoid those common sewing errors. So don't start right on the end, just start 1 or 2 stitches in. Start with your needle down. Keep your threads out the back. Start nice and gently. Go forwards and back. Don't go right off the end. Now you've got 2 neat ends for joining onto your next piece of your garment. Another sewing error you can avoid is by using your fingertips when you're sewing. So when you first start sewing, you tend to sort of hold your sewing here so that when it goes through the machine, the feed dogs are guiding it through and you're keeping your hands out of the way. But if you can learn to have your fingers a little bit closer, you can use the tips of your fingers to check that you've only got the 2 thicknesses of fabric that you want to sew together. That's really good if you're sewing in a sleeve head and you don't want to catch any fabric from underneath. And those mistakes happen when you've got your hands quite far away and it's just sewing whatever it wants to sew. Use your fingers to feel, oh yes, that's nice and flat. I can feel that that's just still 2 layers of fabric. If the sewing seam line is not going well under the machine, do not carry on. Stop, take it out and go and try and fix the problem. Just sewing more and more and more just compounds the problem. It doesn't actually get rid of it. So if it's not sewing well, you need to stop and take a look at your machine and try it out on a test piece. Another way that sometimes sewing starts to compound the mistakes and problems is if you don't unpick a bit that you know has gone wrong. So you might know that your seam allowance isn't correct on a collar and then you think, oh well, I'm not going to unpick it, I'll just put the next bit on using the same seam allowance, and then you end up making the issue worse and worse and worse. So don't underestimate your unpickers at this point, because if you make a sewing mistake, just unpick that little bit and then you can carry on with the rest of the pattern and it will all fit together. Ignoring it will just make the problem get worse and worse and worse. I find as well, if I ignore a problem, when it does get worse, I start to care less and less and less whether the garment is right or not. So if you make a mistake, remember to unpick and get back on track. If you think your sewing is going really well, fantastic, then keep sewing, but don't forget to try on as you go along, because sometimes just a little adjustment on a seam allowance can make a fit much better. If you just make it all like perfectly and you're following the instructions and you're doing all the seam allowances, you will get a perfect garment, but that doesn't mean it will necessarily perfectly fit. So make sure you keep trying on as you go along, particularly before you sew a side seam, before you sew an underarm. You might be able to just nick a little bit more fabric to give your sleeve a little bit more ease, or especially for a length, like make sure that you check your length before you hem, and then your garment will fit much better when it's finished. If things are going really, really wrong, then it's time to maybe take a break. If it's getting a bit sweary and a bit stressy and it's all going wrong, then actually the best thing to do is to stop, turn your machine off and go and have a cup of tea. Sometimes when you come back to it the next day and you read the instruction, you think, why didn't I understand that yesterday? But sometimes in a heightened state of stress, you can't take on any more information. So remember to take regular breaks. A recent but very simple mistake that I used to make was to use my dressmaking scissors by my machine. So I'd grab my dressmaking scissors off the table, cut threads. I'd use them to cut corners, make clips in corners, but they were quite big, and then the tips didn't work very well, so then I would use the V shape at the end, and then you get where you're looking at this bit of the scissors but you're not looking what's happening here, and that's when you make that dreaded snip in the fabric. And it always happens towards the end of your finishing garment where you're snipping off threads and tidying up. A game changer for me has been to have a little pair of scissors by my machine, so I keep these up here for when I'm cutting out, and by my machine I just keep these little hand scissors, and they're brilliant. I haven't snipped anything since because I'm just cutting with a very small blade and I'm watching what's happening to the tips. So that's a little tip for not making that last snip error. My final one is a little bit obvious, but it's happened to us all. May your bobbins always be full, but they're not. So if you're about to sew a really long hem, just check that you can get to the end of the project with your bobbin. The worst one is when you're doing some gathering and you don't check your bobbin and you get part way around your gathering stitch that you want to pull up and you didn't have enough and you have to pull the whole thing out and start again. So if you're about to do something that's quite a long seam line, just have a little look at your bobbin. I can see my bobbin through my plastic top, but if you've got a front loading bobbin, you might need to keep checking it regularly. I hope today's video will help you to eliminate some of your errors. Of course, we all need to make errors because that's how we're going to learn and move on in our sewing journey. If you've got a little tip, then we would love to hear about it, so you can pop that in the comments below. Do make an account and share with us your maker projects. If you go and look at other people's maker projects, sometimes people are really honest about some of the things that they did and some of the mistakes that they made, and we can learn from those too. Thank you very much for watching. See you again soon.